dear President Lagarde, President Kaljulaid, dear guests and colleagues. The Ragnar Nurkse lecture series was initiated by Eesti Pank in 2007 to commemorate the life and achievements of the famous Estonian economist Ragnar Nurkse, and to invite the speakers of the highest caliber to address the Estonian audience. Today I have the honor to present the President of the European Central Bank, Madame Christine Lagarde, to deliver a speech on monetary policy in the euro area as part of the lecture series. But first, let me just say a couple of words about Ragnar Nurkse. He's probably the most famous economic thinker of Estonian descent in the international arena, and a true inspiration, I believe, also for contemporary Estonian economists. Nurkse had a distinguished international career at the League of Nations in Geneva, the first global organization for which achieving the world peace was a mission, and also an academic career at Columbia University in New York. Ragnar Nurkse is considered to be one of the founding fathers of modern development economics, and his works from the 1940s and 1950s are still quoted in economic discussions in Estonia and also internationally. So it is my pleasure to invite President Lagarde to deliver her speech today as part of the lecture series. I'm sure there's really no need to introduce Madame Lagarde in great detail. Let me just mention that before taking the role of the ECB's president in 2019, Madame Lagarde served as the managing director of the International Monetary Fund in Washington and held a number of governmental appointments in France prior to that. I'm honored to welcome you in Estonia and at Eesti Pank. The floor is yours. Thank you.
So, Madame la Présidente, Monsieur le Président, and all of you in your respective positions, ranking, qualities, and titles. And I'm going to ask for your indulgence here. Kuna estlased pole suured arvult siis peavad nad selleks saama vaimult. Thank you. So with due apologies for your beautiful language that I have just tortured, despite the rehearsal that Madis gave me, for those who do not speak fluent Estonian, and I can see some in the room, it says, since Estonians are not in large numbers, they must become so in spirit. And I have to tell you that I've only arrived yesterday, but this is certainly a feeling that you get arriving in Tallinn. From the airport to the hotel, from the hotel to the main square, from the main square to the central bank, from the central bank to the upper town, you have that feeling of strength and determination. And many of you are well-traveled, and so I would claim to be, and this is something that is just sensible and that you can feel. And I know that this spirit will be much needed in the weeks and months to come, and I know that it is highly shared at Eesti Pank. So, what I would like to do on the occasion of this lecture, to which you are all welcome, is talk to you about monetary policy, about commitment, about clarity, and I will try to do that in as simple terms as I can, and if I get too complicated and you are too confused, I know that you'll have a chance to ask a few questions afterwards. So, inflation in the euro area is far too high, reaching double digits for the first time in October. Here in Estonia, inflation has surged to as high as 25%, almost 25%, back in August. The combination of shocks we are facing, war, energy, disrupted supply chain, reallocation of demand, means that inflation is likely to stay above our target for some time. In such challenging times, central banks have to rely on their inner compass, their loyalty to the mandate. What is it? To ensure price stability. Central banks have to be prepared to take the necessary decisions, however difficult, in order to bring inflation back down. Why? Because the consequences of letting too high inflation become entrenched would be much worse for everyone. So what does this imply? The answer can actually be found in the writing of Ragnar Nurkse himself, to whom this lecture series is dedicated. Though he was perhaps better known for his work on international currencies, he also made an important contribution to our understanding of inflation based on his experience of the interwar period. In particular, he showed that fighting inflation is both complex and simple. Complex because in times of great volatility, economies can face a series of shocks which produce rising and persistent inflation. As an example, the 20s. The 20s when inflation was driven in part by tumbling exchange rates and acute supply bottlenecks, including energy. Complex, but simple. Simple because in the end, there is only one way that those shocks can lead to sustained inflation, and that is if monetary policy accommodates them and allows them to feed into inflation expectations. And as Nurkse wrote, and I quote him, "When a price rise goes on for some time, it tends to create expectations of a further rise. The point at which such expectations come to be firmly and widely held is a crucial one in the process of inflation. From that point onwards, the process is entirely changed." End of quote. So today, we are facing an extremely challenging environment where inflation is driven by a range of different shocks. But it is monetary policy that will determine whether these shocks lead or not to lasting inflation, and it will not, because we will not let that happen. As a result, we will have to raise rates to levels that will deliver our 2% medium-term inflation target. The ultimate goal of our interest rate path is clear, and we are not there yet. So in my remarks today, I would like to explain why we are facing such high inflation and assess the risk of that becoming embedded. But I will argue that with two C's, commitment and clarity, commitment to our mandate, clarity about our reaction function, we can navigate the challenges successfully and bring inflation back down to target. So let's first of all look at the forces behind inflation. Why do we have inflation so high? Since the start of the monetary union, we have not witnessed such a rapid shift in the inflation environment. Headline inflation in the euro area, which, remember, back 2 years ago, less than 2 years ago actually, December 2020, inflation was negative, below zero. It was not even 2 years ago. So from there, it has risen by 11 percentage points from its lower end during the pandemic to its level last month. Core inflation, which excludes energy and food, has risen by 4.8 percentage points. 3 interlocking factors have led to that turnaround. The fact that we are facing repeated shocks, number one. The fact that those shocks are passing through more strongly into inflation, second. And third, the fact that they are proving more persistent than in the past due to structural changes in the economy. So let me take those one and try to unbundle them. First, the series of shocks. The euro area economy has been hit by an unprecedented series of shocks on both the demand and the supply sides of the economy. This has restricted aggregate supply while also directing demand towards sectors with capacity constraints. We have faced pandemic-induced lockdowns, supply chain disruptions, energy production cuts, and Russia's unacceptable and unjustifiable invasion of Ukraine. All of that while demand has been shifting back and forth across sectors and at speed. Recently, the reopening of the economy has led to a rapid release of pent-up demand, supported by high levels of savings that we had accumulated during the lockdown period. As a result, our analysis at the ECB finds that demand and supply factors are currently contributing more or less equally to core inflation, with demand being more important for services and supply being more important for industrial goods. And the result of that has been a large and persistent inflationary shock. That's for the series of shock. Let's now look at the pass-through. It is faster and it is stronger than what we have seen in the past. In the past, the pass-through of producer prices to industrial goods inflation typically took around 2 years and was often partially buffered by profit margins. What does that mean? That firms decided to absorb part of the cost increase and not to pass it on to customers. But our analysis finds that recently, the pass-through to inflation has been taking place much faster, lasting only about not 2 years, 6 months. And on average, it has been more intense than in the past, with firms maintaining, and in some sectors, actually increasing their profit margins. So why is that? Well, that is because when inflation is high everywhere and supply is constrained, firms can more easily pass on cost increases to customers without losing market shares to their competitors. If everyone does it, I will do it too. Now, all this has meant that external shocks have seeped into underlying inflation. You know, that part of inflation that is typically more sticky. And even if some of the drivers can be expected to soften as bottlenecks ease, reopening effects fade out and energy prices stabilize, standard measures of underlying inflation in the euro area now range from around 4 to 8%. How about the third factor? Aggravating the situation is the persistence of the shocks due to structural changes in the economy. The shocks triggered by the pandemic and the war have created what I have, in other speeches, called a new global map. New global map of economic relationships. And the economic turning points on this new global map imply that some supply constraints are likely to last for longer. Let me mention 2 of them that I think will resonate with you. Let's look at the gas supply, first of all. The gas supply and the gas shortages caused by the Russian invasion is a major structural change which will have ramification for several years. We're not going to revert back to the old way of doing business. Futures market curves suggest that we will see higher gas prices for a time, as European countries will have to pay a premium to attract uncontracted LNG to replace Russian gas. Substitution effects will probably also increase prices for other sources of energy. Over the longer term, the war is also likely to accelerate the green transition in Europe, including the switch to renewable energy, which should ultimately lead to falling electricity prices. But in the meantime, we could see lower investment in oil and gas, their production and their exploration during the transition phase, putting, therefore, upward pressure on fossil fuel prices, while demand for these fuels will remain high. So it's a tricky transition that we are beginning to experiment, where there will be different pressures and where the medium term is going to be a difficult phase towards a much better and, of course, greener energy mix. Second example that I want to give you of that new global map. We are seeing changes in the nature of globalization itself, and particularly we need to revisit and understand China's role in that globalization. The supply disruption created by the pandemic, the vulnerabilities it has exposed, and the new geopolitical landscape look set to trigger a reassessment of global value chains. Those of you who are concerned about those issues, I've heard many times this reference to not so much reshoring or deshoring, but friendshoring. That's one example. And while this will not, in my view, lead to deglobalization, we can expect geopolitical factors to be reintroduced into supply chains. A recent survey finds that almost 90% of global firms are expecting to regionalize their production over the next 3 years. Now, this obviously, most likely, will reduce efficiency and increase costs in the name of security of supply. And that could create inflationary pressures for some time while supply chains are readjusting. Now, at the same time, domestic policy choices in China, as well as US export controls on key technologies, are likely to also affect China's place in the global production network. This could become a profound global supply shock insofar as it leads the country to turn inwards and away from market-oriented reforms. We'll have to be very attentive to those developments. So, having discussed the forces behind inflation, let's now look at what is of high concern to many of us, which is the risk of second-round effect. Monetary policy cannot prevent the first-round effects of many of these shocks. As I have said on other occasions, what we decide today, Madis Müller, the president of the National Central Bank of Estonia, the other 19 governors at the table, and ourselves, that is not going to lower the price of petrol at the pump. It is not going to instantly reduce the kilowatt per hour of electricity. But when the shocks are persistent, we must ensure that they do not produce those second-round effects that cause too high inflation becoming entrenched. Since the euro area is a net importer of energy, we are facing a large and unavoidable shock to real income owing to the deterioration of our terms of trade. This term of trade tax amounted to around 5 percentage points of GDP in the second quarter of this year only. The question that workers, firms and governments confront today is how should this burden distributed within the economy and over time? Fair burden sharing between income and profit is certainly justified. Fiscal policy can help spread the burden across different income groups. Those are decisions that are not made at the central bank. At the ECB, given our mandate of price stability, the compass that I referred to earlier, we need to ensure that this process does not lead to an inflationary dynamic. If inflation expectations become de-anchored and ingrained in wage negotiations, in price setting, that could lead to a wage price spiral, which in turn sustains the de-anchoring. And the result would be ultimately both lower real income and higher inflation over time. So how acute is this second-round effect risk? How is it? There are factors on the horizon which are likely to reduce demand and therefore, all else being equal, make it harder for firms to pass on cost increases to prices. As wholesale energy prices are passed through into retail bills, households are increasingly feeling the squeeze on real incomes, and consumption is likely to fall. At the same time, pent-up demand from reopening is fading out. The drawdown of excess savings that we have observed during the pandemic seems to be already largely counterbalanced by strengthening precautionary motives for saving and liquidity preferences. In this context, although recent data on GDP growth have surprised on the upside, the risk of recession has increased. The same is true for Estonia, where Eesti Pank estimates growth to be negative 0.5% this year. This domestic slowdown might also be exacerbated by the synchronized tightening of monetary policy globally. Our analysis at the ECB finds that since the early 1990s, US tightening has typically lowered industrial production in the euro area by as much as in the United States itself. However, historical evidence suggests that we should not expect slowing growth to make a significant dent in inflation, at least not in the near term. Looking at all past euro area recessions going back to the 70s, we see that headline inflation fell by an average of about 1.1 percentage point 1 year afterwards, while core inflation fell by about only half of that. Even the additional impact of foreign spillovers on demand will not necessarily lower inflation in the short term. Our analysis finds that US policy tightening tends to reduce euro area inflation in the medium term, but in the near term, inflation will rise if the euro depreciates against the US dollar and commodity prices go up in euro terms. So in that context, we are likely to see wages catching up to some extent with higher inflation, since the conditions are in place for workers to try to recoup losses in their real income. So you see, you have lots of factors going in different directions. The labor market has remained resilient so far, with forward-looking indicators showing little sign of weakening. Inflation expectations have been creeping up. In parallel, governments are facing pressures to increase indexation, for instance, by tying pensions and public sector wages to inflation, which could add to wage pressures in the private sector too. This outlook is confirmed by evidence from the latest collective bargaining rounds and our corporate telephone surveys that we conduct on a regular basis, both of which point to a rise in negotiated wages next year of around 4%. I know it's likely to be much more in Estonia, but on average in the euro area, that's the numbers we have. New growth, I think, is currently running at plus 10%, given the inflation numbers that you have. Now, these developments that I have described so far do not constitute excessive second-round effects so far. And at longer horizons, inflation expectations remain broadly anchored. But with inflation likely to remain high for an extended period, we need to monitor inflation expectations and wage negotiations very carefully to ensure that wage growth does not settle persistently at levels that are incompatible with our target of 2%. So, with that background of the sources of inflation, of the risk of second-round effects that I have tried to explain to you, what can monetary policy do? And how should it be calibrated to ensure price stability? In my view, those two C's that I have mentioned, commitment to our mandate and clarity about our reaction function, are key. Displaying commitment to our mandate is vital to ensure that inflation expectations remain anchored and second-round effects do not take hold. A number of recent decisions by the Governing Council underline our determination in that respect. First, we have been raising rates at our fastest pace ever, by 200 basis points in our last 3 policy meetings. In this way, we are signaling our resolve to deliver on our target, which should be immediately reflected in inflation expectations. Policy normalization also withdraws support for demand at times of inelastic supply, which should lead to firms revising down their selling price expectations. Second, we decided last week to amend the terms and conditions of our targeted longer-term refinancing operations, well known by those in the know as TLTRO 3. What is TLTRO? TLTRO 3 in particular addressed the need for significant stimulus during the pandemic, strengthening the transmission of rates to the economy via banks. I've heard in some corners that we did too much. I'm sorry to say, but had we not done what we did, in addition to a pandemic, in addition to an economy in complete lockdown, we would have faced a major financial crisis. And that would have been a lot worse than anything that we have seen. But of course, the environment has changed enormously. And we need to ensure that the lower cost of funding that we had set to encourage banks to lend to the economy does not, now that the situation has changed, does not impede, does not impair, does not constitute an obstacle to the normalization of monetary policy and to the proper transmission of monetary policy. So this complements our previous actions to preserve the orderly transmission of monetary policy throughout the entire euro area. We had flexible reinvestment under the Pandemic Emergency Purchase Programme. We continue to use it in the reinvestment phase. And we have also created the transmission protection instrument that is intended to facilitate transmission and to protect it. So while it is true that interest rates remain the most effective tool for addressing the high inflation environment, it is also important to signal, as we continuously do in our monetary policy statements, and I will sound like a broken record here, we stand ready to adjust all of our instruments within our mandate to ensure that inflation returns to our medium-term inflation targets. So I have mentioned interest rates and I have mentioned the financing tools as well as the instrument intended to facilitate and secure transmission. But in this context, as I explained at last week's press conference, in December, at our next policy meeting, we will lay out the key principles for reducing the bond holdings purchased as part of our monetary policy portfolio. That's for the commitment. We're not just talking the talk, we are walking the talk. But we need to pair commitment with clarity about our reaction function. In view of the uncertainty that we face today, I don't need to expand on that. It is no longer appropriate for monetary policy to give detailed forward guidance. Given the complexity of the shocks we are facing, being able to respond with agility to the incoming data is a major advantage. But making policy meeting by meeting in a data-dependent way can come at a cost. In particular, market rate volatility is higher in response to news. And this is why, rather than guiding markets by giving a specific target for rates, it is important that we clarify our reaction function. As stated earlier, we have increased rate by 200 basis points, and we expect to raise them further. Our job is far from being completed. And withdrawing accommodation may not be quite enough to bring inflation back to our target. How much further we need to go, how fast we need to get there, will be determined by these factors that I'm going to describe for you. The first and most important factor is the inflation outlook. We will raise rates to levels that bring inflation back down to our medium-term target in a timely manner. The inflation outlook is forward-looking, and it incorporates all the different forces that we are facing. The outlook for the economy, the persistence of the shocks, and the reaction of wages and inflation expectations. And we will be looking at all these elements with great scrutiny. Current inflation numbers are relevant insofar as they provide additional insight about the persistence of inflation, and we look at them also very closely. The second factor, so that's the first one, inflation outlook in all its compositions, sources. The second factor is the corresponding policy stance and its transmission lags into demand and inflation. Monetary policy is inherently forward-looking, as interest rate changes will only reach their full effect over the next year or so, or two. As a result, while the impact of policy decisions will strengthen over time, it will only be seen in the hard data with a time lag. But this lag in transmission and the prevailing uncertainty also means that the rate path ahead will look different depending on the contingencies we face. If we were to see, for instance, inflation becoming more persistent and expectations being at risk of de-anchoring, we could not wait until the full impact of the policy measures materializes. We would need to take additional actions until we are more confident that inflation will return to target in a timely manner. There is also another important dimension to clarity, providing clarity about how the intentions of other policy areas will affect the inflation outlook and thereby our policy action. During the pandemic, the actions of fiscal and monetary policies were naturally aligned. Fiscal policy needed to prevent a catastrophic collapse of employment, and monetary policy had to prevent a steep decline in inflation and make sure that finances was feeding economic activity. Both policies supported price stability. Today, however, the alignment between policies is not so automatic. With the economy slowing and real incomes falling, fiscal policy could shift towards a more expansionary stance, over and above the contribution from the economic stabilizers. But in a supply-constrained environment, that can exacerbate inflationary pressures and force the central bank to tighten policy by more than would otherwise be necessary. This is why we have emphasized the need for fiscal support to be temporary, targeted, and tailored. 30 seconds on those triple T's. It should be temporary so that it does not push up demand too much over the medium term. It should be targeted so that the size of the fiscal impulse is limited and benefits those who need it most. And it should be tailored so that it does not weaken incentives to cut energy demand. Over time, let's not forget that, fiscal policies will have to consolidate, and it will make a difference for inflation whether this is done by reducing transfers and public consumption and raising taxes, or, as has happened too often in the past, by cutting public investment. As many of the sources of inflation today are on the supply side, government policies that redirect investment to where it is needed will be essential to achieve non-inflationary growth. So in conclusion, the environment we confront today is complex. We are facing shocks from various sides while navigating a new global map that is causing those shocks to persist possibly longer. But what monetary policy ultimately has to achieve is simple, and I'm back to the complex and simple description. We must not, and we will not let high inflation become entrenched. We are committed to bringing inflation back down to our medium-term target, and we are determined to take the necessary measures to that effect. The more confident the public is that inflation will indeed return to 2% in a timely manner, the smoother the adjustment process will be. As Samuel Johnson wrote, "Great works are performed not by strength, but by perseverance. And we will persevere until we have ensured price stability in the whole of the euro area." With that, I give you the floor back, and I thank you very much for your attention.
Well, thank you very much, President, for first of all explaining clearly the challenge of high inflation that we're facing in Europe, the sources of it, and also the challenges we are facing as monetary policymakers. Now we have time for a couple of questions. Maybe, if I may, I have a quick one myself first to start with. So, how do you?
I promise you, he hasn't told me which question it was.
Well, we discussed a few, but. Maybe, perhaps you can explain how would you summarize the trade-offs or the balance of risks that we are facing between two options. First of all, us being too slow in reacting to the inflation problem that we have now, and changing the course of monetary policy, versus us being too quick to tighten, and what would the consequences of that be?
You know, I think in the determination that we show, we have to be unequivocally on the side of reaching the target in the medium term, which is the objective that we have set for ourselves, which is the mandate that the treaty has given us. So depending on the circumstances, depending on the level of inflation, obviously we have to use the best tools in the most efficient and the most proportional way. And I think that you're a witness to that because we are at the table together at the Governing Council. We do weigh each and every proposal on the basis of those criteria: proportionality, efficiency, effectiveness. We also know that if we leave inflation run high persistently across the board and for too long, it will be much harder to bring it back. You know, famous central banker, one of our predecessors, said that, you know, once you get the toothpaste outside the tube, it's very difficult to put it back in. You've all experienced that with the toothpaste. Inflation is a bit like that. If you let it out, let it, you know, become embedded, to get it out of the system is a lot more painful. So that's my response.
I think that's a good summary of what we're facing. So let us have questions from the audience. I hope there's a microphone moving around.
This beautiful room has a great sound anyway, so even
yes,
without a mic.
I think we still need the microphone for the video link. Let me maybe group questions. There's one here in the front and one in the back. Carsten, please.
Thanks a lot. I'm Carsten Stair from Tallinn University of Technology. I like your discussion about the linkages between fiscal and monetary policy, and you say we are actually now in a situation where you would not like politicians to press on the accelerator. But the issue is that we don't have a fiscal union, so each country would say it's a small one, Estonia at least, and we could just press on the accelerator without thinking about the consequences for the euro area inflation, which would be zero. Would there be a need, or are you arguing for a fiscal union not only in bad times when we have a corona pandemic to be paid for, but also a fiscal union in the current circumstances?
Should we take a few questions and
Okay.
group them? I see there's one in the back, if we could get the microphone there.
Hello, I'm Christian, Minister of Entrepreneurship and IT here in Estonia, and
Good morning.
good morning. So, as you are well aware, then Estonia has one of the lowest debt to GDP ratios. And so far, it's been hard or next to impossible to connect that to our economic growth. But at the same time, we see clearly the infrastructure that hasn't been built. So putting that into the context of debt forgiveness in the past and now record inflation, like when do the good times start for Estonia? Like when do we get the economic rewards for having a low debt? Thanks.
We want even more rewards, but please.
Well, thank you both of you for your questions that are sort of aiming in the same direction in a way. But let me first of all also recognize the huge progress and the incredible success of the Estonian economy in the last 30 years. You know, looking back at, I'm a former managing director of the IMF, and the IMF played a role before my times, but clearly in those days it was hard. And the Estonian economy was far away from where it is. And I think it's attributable to your determination, your good spirit, and your courage in overcoming the difficulties that the economies faced. And it has had the benefit of also reasonably low rates when it came to investing. So celebrating that. And I'll come to your question first. The answer to your question is yes, but it's a multiple yes. And it's a multiple yes because while we have a euro area monetary union and we determine monetary policy for the whole of the soon-to-be 20 countries, because Croatia is joining us as of the 1st of January. We don't have a fiscal union, and we don't even have at the moment a framework which is to be renegotiated. We don't have banking union, or at least we have 2/3 of banking union, but we're still lagging one pillar, and we don't have capital market union. And I firmly believe that we would work better, more cohesively, would be more efficient if we had a better union on all fronts. Now, I'm not an idiot, and I've been around for a long time now. I could be the grandmother to many of you here. Maybe not the grandmother, maybe just the mother. But I've sat in so many ECOFIN meetings, Eurogroup meetings, and European councils to know that it's not going to happen overnight. What I also know, for having lived through the great financial crisis as a minister and then as managing director of the IMF as of 2011, when we face crisis, we come together and we find solutions. So as we did during the COVID crisis, Next Gen was clearly, and the funds associated with it, with joint borrowing by all countries together through the Commission, was an incredible response to the hardship that we were all facing. I sincerely hope that on the energy front in particular, we will come together. I don't know how long it will take. I don't know how many articles will be written to complain and to moan about how slow Europe is. But at the end of the day, we come with solutions which are innovative, which are different, which bring us together, and where there is solidarity between the small and the bigs, between the rich and the poor, between the north and the south, between those most affected and those more protected. So I know it's a long way to say to you, we need something better in fiscal terms, and I hope that the next Stability and Growth Pact proposal that will be put on the table on November 9th and will be then debated by the leaders and by the finance ministers will take us to a platform that is responding to these criteria that I've just mentioned, and will give all member states in Europe, and particularly in the euro area where we have monetary union, a better sense of togetherness and accountability to each other, and the simplicity of implementing and respecting the rules of the game. But it will not stop me from saying that capital market union is indispensable as well if we want to have real sovereignty in Europe. We must have that. We must complete banking union as well. Lots of efforts are underway. There are national resistance in some corners, and I hope that we can overcome them. It's in times of hardship that we have to close ranks and that we have to overcome some of the territorial and turf issues that are out there. So on the other question of, when is Estonia rewarded for its economic performance and its excellent track record? Well, I would say that the capacity to invest, and you have that capacity, and I really hope that by having a more cohesive euro area in all respects, not just in monetary policy terms, and not just in currency terms, you have demonstrated discipline, fiscal sanity, that is evident from your record. If those debt that you would eventually decide to lift at some stage are directed to those projects that will enhance the productivity of the country, that will improve the infrastructure, that will provide the fertile ground for more and better growth, I think that investors will come. If, on the other hand, from a fiscal point of view, you were to build up transfers and income enhancement, particularly if they were for a long-term duration, I think that would really damage severely the worth and the reputation of the country on financial markets. Now, I know that geography matters. And I know that risks, we've discussed that with high-level interlocutors that I was lucky to see earlier this morning. And this is something that needs to be explained and explained and explained over and over to investors.
We have higher interest rates than countries with much more debt. So when
I think I told you what I just said, which is that investors have a way to look. You know, it doesn't come out of the ECB. The yield on sovereign bonds is essentially determined by the appetite of investors and by a simple supply and demand situation. And it is a fact that in some countries, including yours, the yield and the cost of debt is higher than in other countries. But that's where investors have to be told over and over the nature of risks that they're likely to take. And as I just said, and as you know, and as we all know, geography matters, but the ignorance of geography matters even more. And I think that, you know, we were discussing that earlier. Some people who invest masses of money don't necessarily know exactly where Estonia is, and they ask stupid questions.
Maybe.
Of course it does matter. Fiscal policy matters enormously. Look at what happened across the Channel only 2 or 3 weeks ago. You know, whatever budget, mini, maxi, or medium, if it is not properly financed and if it is not in line with debt sustainability and if it demonstrates carelessness about future financing, you know, investors look at it very quickly, as we saw.
Let's have.
Thank you.
Let's have a few more questions with the microphone, then it's easier to hear also over the video. President Kaljulaid had a question. There's a microphone.
First, I would like to help my dear friend Christine with a remark. Estonia has had persistently low unemployment rates, so more investment from fiscal side would have probably been resulted in a high inflation. But that said, my question is actually different. My question is indeed related to the short-term fiscal policy. How can small economies who are by definition unable to outcompete, let's say, Germany's kind of subsidies for energy cost, but have to try to do so because otherwise our economy suffers more? And we know that the European, common market is broken. It used to be forbidden to subsidize whatever production. Now through energy subsidies we are subsidizing everything and nobody's punished. Actually they should be. How long do you think that lasts, and how good is the cooperation between you and the European Commission to try to resolve this persistent issue, which is getting actually worse every day? Coming from a small economy, I know we cannot outcompete Germany. I know, for example, Slovakia is trying fixing energy prices at extremely low, 60 euros per megawatt hour. This is something which needs to be resolved urgently. Are you working on it? Thank you.
It is not, Madam President. Thank you for your friendship, first of all, and for the good work that we did in the past. It's not for the European Central Bank to reform the energy market. And it's high time for the Commission to respond to the request of the European Council. And I hope that this is done in short order and that the terms of trade are fair. Because you're right, those countries, without even pointing the finger at any of them, those countries that have a lot of fiscal space, that are sizable and that have access to financing at cheaper rates than others, have a competitive advantage. And this is a debate that, I don't want to comment on that. It was a highly political debate at the last European Council, if I recall. But I think that the pressure now is on the Commission, where the reform of the energy markets and the way in which a collective response is given to the situation has to be fair. There has to be a level playing field. It cannot be, as I think it's been said many times, it can be each country on its own and the rest is ignored. We are together in this business.
Perhaps we have time for one last question from the second row. Martti, please.
Thank you. Martti Randver, Central Bank of Estonia. I have a question about the monetary policy tools in our disposal. That you mentioned that the primary tool currently is obviously the interest rate tool. In principle, we also have quantitative tightening, selling our financial holdings as a possibility. How do you see these two measures? Do you see them very complementary? Do you see that the transmission channels are slightly different? And how you see the sort of optimal sequencing of these measures? Thank you.
You jumping the gun, dear colleague. Because as I said in my speech, those principles, modus operandi, and cost-benefit analysis of how much, how slow, how soon, will be debated in December. So we will, at the December press conference, if my colleagues so eventually agree, I will be able to address your question. But I would simply say one thing. We have to collectively admit that we do not know a lot about quantitative tightening. We've experienced quantitative accommodation over the course of time, but quantitative tightening is, for the moment, experimented by a couple of other central banks, the Bank of England being a case in point in particular, and we're learning from what they're doing, and we have to address that with this level of experimentation and humility that should, in my humble view, take us to go chi va piano va sano.
Thank you.
And we will have, look, you know, with TLTRO 3 revised interest rates as of the 23rd of November, and probably the decision made by banks to reimburse earlier, we will have also some learnings from that we should take into account. Thank you. But more to come, December 14th.
Thank you very much, Christine, and I think a round of applause is in order. Yeah. Thank you. So, ladies and gentlemen, I would like to conclude the event today with the award ceremony for Eesti Bank's research competition. The Eesti Bank research competition, it is intended to encourage scientific work by young economists studying at Estonian universities and to draw attention to outstanding economic research. The Eesti Bank Research Award is being granted for the 20th time this year, so I think we have a solid tradition already. And since 2011, the award has been granted in two categories. One for research leading to a doctoral thesis or as part of doctoral studies, and the other for research leading to a master's dissertation or done part of a master's level course. We have two winners also this year, and I would like to congratulate them today on their achievement. First, the winner of the Eesti Bank Research Award in the category of doctoral studies is Triinu Tapfer of Tallinn University of Technology for her article Luck and Skill in the Performance of Global Equity Funds in Central and Eastern Europe. The article investigates whether actively managed funds offer different returns first compared to passive funds, and also whether that difference can be attributed to luck or skill of the fund managers. And secondly, the winner of the Eesti Bank Research Award in the category of master's level work is Pearl Eti of the University of Tartu for her master's thesis on the sufficiency of debt relief as a panacea to sovereign debt crisis in Sub-Saharan Africa, a case study of Ghana, Nigeria, and Zambia. And the thesis shows that for all three countries, the programs offered only temporary relief and did not really have a long-term impact on the accumulation of debt. So I guess the message is that structural reform really is also necessary. And I would like to invite both winners onto the stage to hand over the awards, please. Triinu. Ja. Palju õnne, proovime kuidagi pildile jääda. Siia poole. Nii, see on diplom ja lilled samuti. Saanud lilled. Pearl, congratulations. And Christine, if we could have a joint picture, it would be nice. Thank you very much for all of you, to all of you for coming.